Una palabrita, soy el director del instituto y para darles un poquito de contexto, una de las cosas que estamos haciendo en años recientes es que cuando le damos fondos a los estudiantes graduados, les estamos pidiendo que hagan una presentación de su trabajo a los estudiantes de la facultad, con la idea de que pues vamos a celebrar este trabajo y aprender. Para mí personalmente lo más interesante es ver las técnicas de investigación, los retos, las posibilidades. Y me interesa que los estudiantes graduados estén expuestos a intercambiar ideas, porque a veces muchos estudiantes están solicitando fondos para hacer este tipo de trabajo y no conocen los retos o posibilidades y los trucos de cómo conseguir información. O sea que bienvenido, mucho gusto. No sé si ahí, Mark, ¿quieres decir algo más?
Eso me parece, o sea, es un trabajo muy interesante de conectar algunos temas clásicos con un enfoque nuevo. Y bueno, viene progresando bastante Santiago. Ahora veremos la devolución de esta experiencia y sus informes.
Pero pasamos a ti, gracias.
Bueno, ok. Lo voy a hacer.
¿Inglés? Español, pregunta las personas que posiblemente estén en línea.
No, en línea no hay nadie, lo que están haciendo es grabarlo.
En inglés, creo que está listo en inglés.
Sí, lo único que voy a decir en español es simplemente unas palabras de agradecimiento por haber financiado la investigación en el verano y bueno, darme la oportunidad de ordenar mis ideas y presentarlas acá. So, may America be for humanity. With these words, Argentinian delegate Roque Sáenz Peña finished his speech in the first Pan American Conference in opposition to U.S. stance. The relationship between the United States and Argentina has been researched for many historians, but they tend to view only these two countries, making special focus on economic relations. My focus is centered on the occupation of Cuba and the U.S. influence on this country in the following years. It's an analysis on diplomatics and intellectual discourse on Cuba and Latin America in the context of U.S. rise to power. First of all, why Cuba? Cuba was the Latin American country that had the most direct and explicit intervention of the United States, becoming the best example of the Yankee danger. Meanwhile, Argentina was trying to become the true leader of the continent in opposition to the Colossus of the North. The main question this research focuses is how the Cubans were viewed in Argentina's discourse. Was this view positive because of a common Hispanic culture, or negative because Cubans were considered non-white? How did the desire to lead the continent and the racial conceptions of the time shape the country's and the people's response to the conflict between the United States and Cuba? And, a question that I recently had is how Cubans feel about Argentina's status. For this, I have traveled to Argentina and visited the Library of Congress, the Foreign Relations Archive, and the newspaper archival to gather information about the speeches and writings of Argentina's diplomats and intellectuals. The interventions in the Caribbean raised the alarms for many people in Argentina who gave speeches and wrote in newspapers and magazines of the time against the United States and their increasing influence in Latin America. In many cases, this opposition to U.S. dominance became a defense of Latin America in a context of a rebirth of a Hispanic sentiment. In this context, the main events that I have decided to focus my research on are the events that took place in Cuba between the War of Independence and the elimination of the Platt Amendment, and between that, the first 7 Pan-American conferences. These conferences were meetings held between the United States and the countries of Latin America in an effort to displace European influence and establish a U.S. economic commercial hegemony. They became the scenario where Argentina battled against the United States for the continental leadership. You will probably notice that as the exposition continues that I have more information about the first event. That's because it's an ongoing research. So, to give a sense of where we are standing, between the 1850s and the 1880s, Argentina had signed a constitution, finished the intermittent civil wars that been going on for several decades, conquered the South that was occupied by the indigenous, established a capital in Buenos Aires, and secured the frontiers with the neighboring countries. During that same period, the United States had been through the Civil War, abolished slavery, and finished the conquest of the West. Basically, in the 1880s, both countries had established political stability, internal peace, and their economy was growing fast thanks to the open trade and immigration. So, in 1889, President Miguel Juárez Celman sent Roque Sáenz Peña and Manuel Quintana to the first Pan American Conference. The first one had fought in the Pacific War on the side of Peru and had served as Minister of Foreign Relations. And the second one was a senator. And a curious thing is that both will become presidents of the nation years later. What I mean by this is that they were very important politicians. They were not just sending anyone to this conference. Actually, another person that was meant to go originally was Vicente Gregorio Quesada, who was then the ambassador of Argentina in Washington, but he said that he preferred not to go because he would have to moderate himself, not confront the United States. Maybe that was a good idea because he had written things like this. Changing course to please the Yankees would be forcing us to perpetuate our lands deserted and to become servants in the trade of such lords. The Argentine doctrine is broader, more generous, more humanitarian than that of Monroe because it's essentially cosmopolitan and does not give birth to nationality and prerogative. The Yankee doctrine is selfish because they understand it and want to apply it exclusively to them. In this way, America for the Yankees, not even for those born in South America. So only Sáenz Peña and Quintana went, and there they met José Martí, who was there despite Cuba not being in the conference. José Martí, the famous Cuban poet and revolutionary, had been living in New York since 1880 and writing for Argentina's newspaper La Nación since 1882. Over that time, he wrote for the paper commenting on various topics like the political arena, racial conflicts, economic growth, sports violence, the construction of Brooklyn Bridge, the earthquake of Charleston, the colonization of the West, and the inauguration of the Statue of Liberty. This gave him the chance to perfect his writing skills and cement solid relations with Argentina and other South American countries. In fact, in 1887, La Nación offered him to work in Buenos Aires, but he rejected it because he wanted to be close to Cuba and the revolutionary movement. When the Pan American Conference began, the Cuban poet was consolidated as an anti-imperialist and had established strong ties to numerous Latin American countries thanks to his travels and journalist work. On December 19, 1889, he wrote in the pages of La Nación, after examining it with judicial eyes the background, causes, and factors of the invitation, it is urgent to say, because it is the truth, that the time has come for Spanish America to declare its second independence. This conference was the perfect scenario for Latin American republics to face together the United States and its overwhelming advance. For Martí, the United States was the danger not just for Cuba, but for all Latin American republics that had already become independent from Spain. There is some pessimism in his declaration, assuming that the region is already under US influence, but it's also call to action. He also criticized that this conference was called Pan-American, and I made this little map here to explain it. In red are basically all the countries that were invited and participate, and of course the host country. In blue, we have two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, that were invited but did not send their representatives. And in black, we have all the ones that were not invited because they were not independent or because they were Canada. So basically, he said that like a lot of countries were missing to call it Pan-American. And if any doubts remain about Martí's thought about this Congress at the United States, 2 months later, he wrote the United States is absolutely dominated by economic corruption. It's eager to take over Santo Domingo and Cuba. The conference is a struggle between the forces of good and evil. End of the quote. So he was hoping that this event would provide unity among the Hispanic republics, that the brothers of the continent would extend their solidarity and help the Caribbean nations threatened by the evil of the North that was coming for the Caribbean and now the rest of the continent, but he would get some disappointment about that. This is a picture of all the representatives of the Congress. I marked there with an arrow Roque Sáenz Peña, and just below him you can see Manuel Quintana with his characteristic mustache and beard. According to Martí, the Argentinian delegation was received in the United States with the highest honors. Everyone talked about them with respect and background information. They looked for correspondence in the Southern Cone, demanding more information and showing great interest in investing. Quintana even met with Andrew Carnegie and Sáenz Peña with Vanderbilt. All of this shows the importance that Argentina had at the moment. It was really becoming a major power and an important player in geopolitical affairs. Its economic expansion and political stability and growing population, along with all the resources in its territory, made it a serious competitor for continental leadership that was hard to ignore. Now, as soon as they arrived, the delegates were invited to ride on a railroad. The trip was designed to sell the delegates on the idea of building a Pan-American railroad, but it was also meant to show them the riches of the United States. The train had feather beds, a bathroom car, press car, library, barber shop, bar car, and a French restaurant. And it traveled from Nicaragua and to West Omaha, stopping at West Point and passing copper mills in Detroit, oil wells in Ohio, ports, factories, breweries, ranches, water fields, slaughterhouses, and universities. But the envoys from Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, along with Martí, stayed back because they wanted to plan their strategy ahead. So, who was Sáenz Peña, or what was he thinking? He had thoughts of Hispanic American unity and anti-imperialism that is shown in this letter here that he sent to Quintana before the Congress. The purpose is underway, my dear friend, and it must be developed within framework, without a frame, as vast and broad as the two hemispheres. Only in this way can we restore the value and prestige of our race, proceeding with the same determined zeal with which we address problems of national interest, because indeed loving one's race is not other thing than expanding the nation in an atmosphere of justice and historic vindication. Sáenz Peña, like many people in his time, saw the world in terms of race. He viewed the United States as racially different from Latin America. The Hispanic republics, sharing the same culture, should unite against the Anglo-Saxon America. Both Sáenz Peña and Martí shared this idea of races, but not as an issue of biology, but understanding it as an issue or as a union of languages, religion, tradition, and sentiment. Martí, in fact, wrote against the idea that the white race was superior to the black, claiming that only provoke rancor and division. I have here this quote: "No man has any special rights because he belongs to one race or another. The black man, as a black man, is not inferior or superior to any other man. The white man who says my race is also redundant. Anything that divides men from each other, that separates them, singles them out, or hems them in, it is a sin against humanity. The white man who, by reason of his race, believes himself superior to the black man, acknowledges the idea of race and thus authorizes and provokes the black races. The black man who trumpets his race, when what he is perhaps trumpeting instead is only the spiritual identity of all races, authorizes and provokes the white races." Martí was not against the idea of race that San Peña uses. That is a group of people that share the same culture. But he was against just as this idea of race as a justification for white supremacy. He saw how that divided the US society and did not want the same for Cuba. He also wrote, in Cuba, there is no fear whatsoever of a race war. Man means no more than white, no more than mulatto, no more than black. Cuban means no more than white, no more than mulatto, no more than black. On the battlefields, the souls of whites and blacks who died for Cuba have risen together through the air. So the Cuban poet would follow Argentina's delegates' activity on the Pan American Conference in Washington, and the confrontation arose when the United States tried to win support for his most ambitious project, the customs unions for the Americas. And there it's where San Peña takes place. The idea of the customs unions is based on the Prussian Zollverein, that was a common market founded in 1834 that later helped to the unification of Germany in 1870. For the United States, it was proposed that the new world common market might result in similar benefits, creating hemispheric economy that would ensure United States supremacy. But Argentinians were convinced that the customs unions was meant to build protectionist wall around America that would benefit only the United States industry. San Peña argued that they were making the other countries lift their commerce restrictions without lifting theirs, and accused them of trying to isolate Latin America from their traditional European trading partners. Don't count with open doors that have been previously closed to us. We declare that our customs will remain without alteration and open for the continent as for the rest of the world. In those years, Argentina was selling great quantities of meat and cereal to Europe and receiving large amounts of invests and immigrants from the same place. San Peña was defending this relation that had been so beneficial to Argentina. The United States was then looking to replace Europe as the provider of manufactures and investments, but without buying Argentina's agricultural production. So, San Peña finished his speech praising the European countries with a highlight in Spain. He said, and I quote, "I do not forget that over there is Spain, our mother, contemplating with sincere joy the development of its former domains under the rule of generous and virile people that inherit her blood." This highlighted the Hispanic feeling on the Argentina's delegate that was shared by Martí. And here I have this to explain it. Basically, the Hispanic or anti-Hispanic feeling in Latin America went from one side to another during the century. After the independence, it was easy to be against anything that came from Spain. But that later in the 1830s or 40s, depending on the country, caused a reaction for the caudillos that they wanted to vindicate the culture of Spain against the culture from England or France that the elite was praising. But later the caudillos became tyrants, and so when they were overthrown, an anti-Hispanic sentiment came back. And here in the 1890s, with the US expansion over Latin America, was a new Hispanic feeling was coming. Nothing unites people more than a common enemy. So the Monroe Doctrine said America for Americans, claiming that Europeans could not retake their colonial possessions in America or try to colonize their new frontiers. Many people denounced this as a lie that actually meant America for the United States, like we saw on Gregorio Quesada. After rejecting the customs unions for considering it an attempt of the United States to appropriate the continent, the last sentence from San Peña's speech was what I said at the beginning of the presentation: "May America be for humanity." The conference did not reach an agreement at this point and left it for the next meeting. Martí was impressed with San Peña's confrontation and praised his attitude. He said, and I quote, "When the Argentinian delegate San Peña said, like someone challenging him, the last sentence of his speech about dissolving the sentence that is a banner and there was a barrier. May America be for humanity. Everyone stood up in gratitude, understood what he was saying, and extended their hands. This also reached Argentina, like in the newspapers. This is from La Nación. On the 22nd of May, the pages said, it is a brief and graphic motto of all the genuine policy of our America. It is the summary of the most advanced and progressive of the American aspirations that have achieved conscience on itself as the consequence of the elaboration of the principles of our historical elaboration. America for Humanity will be acknowledged as a phrase that summarizes all the ideas that Martí and so many other Latin American intellectuals were writing for so many years, since Peña had synthesized these ideas and exposed them in the capital of the empire before the eyes of the entire world. But this Congress was not only about trade, it was also about the diplomacy. The Latin American countries were very much interested in having all these things recognized by the United States, but that didn't prove easy. The United States was in favor of arbitration, but Latin Americans insisted that arbitration alone wasn't sufficient to ensure peace and justice. For arbitration to be effective, for it to be true a mechanism of prevention of war, it had to be linked both to what I show here, the renunciation of the right to conquest and the recognition of sovereign equality. So in this commission, Argentina's delegate Manuel Quintana said that arbitration won't work without this. And after some debate, a compromise was reached with the delegates agreeing to vote first on arbitration, which would remain in effect for a 20-year period. That resolution passed unanimously. Then the delegates moved on the discussion to conquest, and Quintana offered his resolution saying this here, whereas there is in America no territory which can be deemed as res nullis, therefore the principle of conquest shall never be recognized admissible under the American public law. This, of course, like the United States opposed, and the resolution ended up being that this would be there was going to be a limit on the ban of conquest for 20 years, with a commitment to revisit this question after that time, and that's it. Like, it wasn't what they hoped for, but they just gathered what they could. So at the end of this first Pan-American countries, Martí could not avoid feeling disappointed. Those who should be brothers had not introduced the topic of Cuba into the official minutes and had turned the bad side. But Martí could not call fraternal republics selfish because he had to wear a smile and await for their help for Cuba. In the end, he learned not to trust apparent solidarity of the other countries regarding Cuba's situation. And regarding the United States, I think that this was maybe the most evident scenario for what was expressed by Greg Grandin in his book, America, America. North America looked to Spanish America not as an alien other, but as a competitor, a contender in an epic struggle to define a set of nominally shared but actually contested ideas: Christianity, freedom, law, sovereignty, property, equality, liberalism, democracy, and above all, the very meaning of America. Now, going on with further events. As we know, 8 years after the conference, the United States declared war on Spain and intervened in Cuba's War of Independence. This was basically the worst scenario planted by Martí, who had died starting this independence war, but not before writing Nuestra América, his most remembered article, where he expressed many of the ideas that he had elaborated during the first Pan-American Conference. Roque Sáenz Peña was still alive and was invited to a Spanish immigrant to an event of the Spanish immigrant community in Buenos Aires. He said that the U.S. intervention was illegal and Cuba deserved to be independent, but without attacking Spain. He pointed out the hypocrisy of the Monroe Doctrine, condemning the European interventions, but reserving that right for them. Another important personality that attended this ceremony was Paul Grusac, a French-born intellectual who arrived to Argentina at the age of 18 without money and without even speaking Spanish, but somehow he became an intellectual with close ties with the government. Unlike Sáenz Peña, he did not defend Cuban independence and affirmed that this was financed by the United States with the only purpose of an exit and obtained by force what was denied by money. This annexation that the United States intended with Cuba, motivated by the commercial relations, didn't make sense to Grusac, who claimed that what binds people together are race and common history. The occupation of Cuba ended in 1901, but with the imposition of the Platt Amendment to the Cuban Constitution that gave the United States the right to intervene the island whenever they saw their interest endangered. That same year, the Second Pan American Conference was being celebrated in Mexico. Paul Grusac, who at the moment was the director of the National Library in Buenos Aires, again, someone that arrived without even speaking Spanish, ended up being the director of the National Library, said that this conference, like the first one, had nothing to offer to Argentina, that the United States was seeking precisely what the South American countries needed to avoid. He pointed out the hypocrisy of celebrating this in a country formerly dismembered by them. This conference, he said, was only good for protesting against the conquest of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. And by the way, I found this speech on a Cuban newspaper, so that gives us some idea of the reach of this and how Cubans care for it. Now, on the diplomatic arena, the Argentina was trying to get recognition for the Drago Doctrine. This principle stated that public debt cannot give rise to armed intervention, much less to the material occupation of the soil of American nations. This was issued on the context of a blockade on Caracas port by European powers under the pretext of collecting debt. But like it was hard to get recognition because if the United States recognized this doctrine, that would imply the acknowledgement that the interventions in Cuba and Puerto Rico were illegal because they were done under the pretext of securing U.S. citizens, their investments and their properties. As we know, the United States did not acknowledge this and issue instead the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine to justify their interventions, positioning the country as the continent's police. It's interesting that even though Roosevelt points out Cuba as a model country that's been civilized by the United States, as you can see here in this quote, the country would intervene and occupy the island once more in 1906, only 2 years after this proclamation, and just after the end of the Third Pan American Conference, in which Argentina failed to get support for the Drago Doctrine. Unlike the intervention of 1898, this time there were no big complaints from Argentina. Like there were, of course, comments on the press, but the government was trying to not to collide with the United States, because at this moment South America was receiving the visit of the Secretary of State, Eli Root. He had been present at the Third Pan American Conference in Rio de Janeiro, and in August he was visiting Buenos Aires. It was the first time that the U.S. Secretary of State was visiting the region. He was a defender of the Monroe Doctrine and the main architect of the Platt Amendment, drafting most of its articles. Having the Secretary of State in a diplomatic visit, like Argentina's diplomats could not risk offending him with a declaration against the intervention of Cuba. Another way of seeing this is that in the eyes of the Argentinian government, Cubans were not worth the risk of jeopardizing their relationship with the United States. This position would continue over the fourth Pan American Conference, which, by the way, was in Buenos Aires. Instead of standing against Monroe Doctrine and Pan Americanism, the Argentinian diplomats took a more conciliatory position. The Argentine government was trying a more diplomatic approach in its effort of winning leadership for the continent against the United States. This gives us an idea of how the Argentinians care for Cubans and they have a sentiment of brotherhood with Latin America, but this had its limits. And a more clear example of that came in 1912. A massacre against Black Cubans occurred around the month of May. Although there was no intervention of the government, the United States did land troops in Cuba. And instead of protesting against this massacre perpetrated by the Cuban government or against the United States sending troops to Cuban soil, the Argentine delegation in Washington described the U.S. presence in Cuba as justifiably protective to American business interests. The Argentine Chargé d'Affaires in Havana, Jorge Reyes, justified the intervention, describing the protest as marauding negradas. Now, scientific racism and social Darwinism were common and highly valued at that time in Argentina. Many people consider indigenous and Africans as inferior races, and their subjugation by white people a proof of that. It was through civilization brought by whites that these races could be elevated. Some people even believe that blacks and whites could not live together. And here are some quotes that may help to explain this. Paul Gursak, who we talked already, wrote, "I do not support slavery, but I can't stop repeating that the black freedman and citizen is the stain, black naturally, of the Republican victory and the onerous ransom of the War of Secession. The Republic of Liberia, meaning return of these Africans to their home, was brilliant, but they do not want to return to their land, and the lynching with which they are trying to convince them are arguments of little effectiveness." Here is also Carlos Bunge, a very famous sociologist of the time, who wrote, "Each race has its race character. The Hispanic is arrogant, indolence, lacks practically in spirit, verbosity, uniformity, decorum. The indigenous people of America, resignation, passivity, revenge. The black, the black, slavery, softness, and when they connect with white, something that I would call hyperesthesia or aspiration." These people valued the work and history of the Spanish Empire, but they considered the mestizaje as a mistake, contrary to what we have seen in Martí or Sáenz Peña. Considering this position about the indigenous, the Africans, and the mixing of races, it is not surprising that Argentinian press, intellectuals, and diplomats didn't express much concern for the massacre of blacks in Cuba. From Mexico to Argentina, there was a common Hispanic past and culture, but this not meant equality. The idea of Argentina as the leader of the Hispanic republics was based in white supremacy. Argentina remained white and European without mixing with the Africans and the indigenous, so at least at a lower level than other parts of Latin America. That, along with its Hispanic history and culture, made it the best candidate for leading Latin America. Now, in the next Pan American Conference, the opposition to the Platt Amendment and U.S. intervention would incentivize, with Argentina's delegate presenting an anti-war pact with the United States ended up accepting. After the crash of Wall Street, the United States no longer had the power to hold its intervention policy. The Monroe Doctrine was not only strongly criticized, but also rejected for most of the Latin American diplomats. And on May 29, 1934, the Platt Amendment was eliminated. This concern for Cuba took place in the framework of the U.S. rise to power, the spread of U.S. interests, and the intervention of Cuba and other countries that came later raised the alarms for many people in Argentina, provoking a rebirth of Hispanic sentiment. The Latin American republics started to view themselves as brothers that would be united under the threat of a common enemy, and Argentina viewed itself as the leader of that union. But after the first couple of decades, Argentina's ministers of foreign relations adopted a less confrontation position and sought to strengthen the regional leadership, not by openly and totally confronting the United States, but by negotiating. This also affected the view on Cuba. At the beginning, there was solidarity, although no specific action was made in favor of Cuba. Argentina's diplomats and intellectuals talk about how they defended about how Cuban sovereignty by the United States was an attack on Latin America that must be stopped, but in practice they defended their own interests. It was clear that not all Latin American countries were the same. Cuba was seen as non-white and thus inferior. This union of Hispanic republics would only happen under the leadership of Argentina because all the other countries had too many indigenous or black people. Argentina, like the United States, had remained white by casting out the indigenous and not mixing with them and incentivizing European immigration. But unlike the United States, they were Hispanic and not Anglo-Saxon. This made them more compatible with the other Latin American countries. So Martí's idea of a continent united beyond races was not shared by Argentina's intellectuals beyond Sáenz Peña. If Cubans felt sympathetic to Argentina at the beginning, they quickly stopped being. They were not persuaded by this kind of discourse, and maybe that's one of the reasons why this continental leadership failed. Thank you.
America book is really good.
Yeah, I read it with Mark, and yeah, like
Put it down.
yeah, like the chapter about this, like the Pan American Conference, I think it's really good because it's something that it's sometimes hard to explain because there are many things happening at the same time. Like I didn't even talk about Brazil, that like the delegates arrived as representatives of the Brazilian Empire and came back as representatives of the Brazilian Republic. But he like managed to explain it without you getting so confused.
Right.
Okay. Any question?
What do you? So I think you've nicely portrayed the kind of possibilities and limits of the sort of generation of '80 racial vision and how that shaped their ambitions, but also limited their solidarity. I wonder how, if at all, does this change with the kind of rise? I mean, obviously towards the end of the story we had but all across the Americas a sort of rise of different discourses of mestizaje that have their own social dynamics, but there's a kind of a whole reivindication from within Cuba of Cuba's Africanness. There's a Brazilian, with complexities, sort of reivindication over the course of the 1930s. There obviously is a sort of different dimensions of a post-revolutionary Mexican reivindication of indigenousness and to a much lesser extent, blackness. And all that is also connected with regionalism and with kind of criollismo, right?
Okay.
So how does that play into this, right? I mean, the kind of sense of what Latin America means in the 1920s and 1930s is quite different from what it was at an elite level in the 1890s or 1900s. Do you see that at all? I mean, I know you haven't totally gotten as much into these the diplomatic papers and encounters there, but where do you see kind of connections there, or is there just a divergence? Is it that there's a kind of convergence in the 1890s of a sort of high politics and kind of cultural dynamics, and there's a divergence in the 1930s?
Yeah, like what I noticed is that like the other Latin American countries try to make proud of their mestizaje, and Argentina is like basically denying it, saying that no, we're white were European.
Still in the 20s and 30s, you're saying, or
Yeah,
Yeah.
Like there is there's a whole literature about this, like el mito de la nación blanca, creo que es, some consider. So and you asked like where I see this in diplomacy.
Mhm.
Well, I think there is like something there, like because of this like lack of action or at least even in the just in the speech, you know, yeah, even in the declarations that there is like well, there's also to be considered the change of the government because la generación del 80 like prioritized the relations with Europe. It's later that with the Unión Cívica Radical that they like try to pursue better relations with with the Latin American countries, but I don't know like how much was like done in practice from that. Like there's certainly something there.
I like that swinging back and forth between Hispanic and anti.
Yeah.
I've never thought about that. So where are they right now?
Where are we right now? I think it's coming back. I think they're like after this, this keeps going on during basically the whole 20th century until maybe the 60s and 70s, where the indigenous, like how would you say it, indigenous ideology, creates like a certain like anti-Hispanic sentiment.
Right.
And now, at least in Argentina, at least officially, it's and the government it's done, it's in favor of Spain, in favor of the Western culture and the work of the Spanish Empire.
I wanted to ask you about Argentinians' perception of whiteness relative to the whiteness of the United States. I know you spent most of your time really thinking about Argentina versus Cuba, but in thinking about their perceptions of themselves as natural leaders of Latin America because of their non-mixing, right? Because of their whiteness. Is that also because they perceive themselves to be the natural leaders to go against something like the United States, which is also very much the white country? But so I was thinking about like how they see themselves vis-a-vis US leaders, but I was also thinking about one of those slides you had in which the guy is saying, well, every race has their feature, and there's the Hispanic race, and the Hispanic race isn't ideal either, really. That guy, yeah, because well, you know, but they're also are they also sort of distinguishing themselves? Because I mean, the natural leaders of Latin America to me wouldn't be arrogant, indolent, lacking practicality. So, you know.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's because like what he's saying is that we are the natural leaders because we are like Europeans, because of all the arrival of European immigrants to Argentina made that the common Argentinian was more European than Hispanic. Like I'm not saying the Hispanic sentiment was like shared by everyone, and there could be some like Bunge that didn't estimate that too much, and what he said was we are the fit candidates because ethnically we're white.
But at the same time, when you go in and out of these Hispanic, anti-Hispanic periods, you also have to separate the white from the Hispanic.
Yeah. Like that's certainly like a discussion, like if Hispanic is the same as white or it's a separate thing. I get what you're saying. Like here, it's when it gets messy.
Well, I mean, there are two ways I think that you could tackle that highlight that, right? One is that the generation of 80, not Bunge, but other elements are overwhelmingly provincial.
Yeah.
They're
They're
all
the
from the
provincial,
interior, they're all
they're
from
the
provinces.
provincial elites.
Yeah, the provincial elites, they kind of went out through, a series of internal struggles and from the 1880s, rule, and Roca is the kind of figure in this, and then the other guys, Settlement and others too. None of them would describe their provinces as white.
Mm.
No one describes Tucumán.
Tucumán, no,
as
definitely
white,
not.
right, and none of the interior, so they're not just from the interior, they're from the indigenous black mestizo interior.
Mm-hmm.
They themselves are white. And I mean, because they're part of it, so there's also, there's another interesting tension in all this, right, which is that one way that that's resolved, the way that it's resolved in their own minds, I think, without much complication, is that they think of themselves just as they are the white elites of a Hispanic mestizo region,
Mm-hmm.
right, within Argentina. So they are, and then they've come to lead this country that's being racially transformed by migration, or so they think.
Mm-hmm.
So they are the sort of continental leaders of this kind of project of transformation with Hispanic roots, but also kind of open to Europe and so forth. So, I mean, at that level of abstraction, I don't think that they feel much contradiction, but anyone that they're actually interlocutors to would, right? I mean, it's a very, so a thing that you might think about is how they, they have this kind of expansive vision of America for humanity. But it also, the way that it ties together is in the justification of, a very small group
Mm-hmm.
As the heads of these processes. So I think there kind of some more attention to those particular, conflicts and the way that they negotiate them, and the degree to which they're willing or not. There are much greater openness earlier in conversations with Awardee, and how that kind of closes down, I think, is something to attend to.
Yeah.
Let me try and introduce a different language. So you have the notion of the raza cósmica,
Sí.
Yeah.
which can reconcile all of that,
Yeah.
because you say the white civilizer and everybody else is, and I mean, I still hear it. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez using the cosmic race idea to describe. I mean, it's something that's transcended across ideology. In the United States, you use the term of hypodescent, right? and that becomes much more biological at least in the courts, by the 1930s. Before that, it's judges making all these sort of national, racial, equating the national with the race. You see the change to biology really around 1930s. So there are two notions of racial hierarchies operating simultaneously in Latin America and in the United States that sometimes may or may not necessarily meet. You can say, well, they meet in the idea of white supremacy, but in the rule of hypodescent, there is no cosmic race. Whereas in the cosmic race, you have this fluidity. And I wonder whether periodicizing when these debates sort of enter the public sphere might help to disentangle some of this. For example, in the case of the Spanish-American War, Puerto Ricans were considered white, even though the media represented them as brown.
Yeah,
and they had to be considered white because that's the only way you can extend citizenship. Right. In the case of Argentina, which is, I think, for me, is really interesting. You also had this idea of copying the U.S. Constitution of like in Puerto Rico, and now with Milei, he's getting a bailout. So there are these moments where you have these U.S. and absorption of U.S. ideologies through law that might impact, and I don't know enough. I mean, I just want to
of course,
that might shape some of these debates. And I'm particularly interested in this Hispanic, anti-Hispanic, and how that correlates to when elites were trying to apply the U.S. Constitution or translate it, if you will, because that's happening in Mexico, that's happening throughout Latin America also. So there are all these elite efforts to transplant, if you will, legal ideologies that may have some social repercussions. But for me, when I'm hearing you, I'm seeing like moments that have to be separated, particularly in the debate around race. And I wonder, I don't know whether there's this Hispanic, anti-Hispanic is also related to efforts by elites to transplant, if you will, U.S. ideologies and operationalize them. I see that in Mexico. I see a little bit of that in Argentina. So the question, I guess, is how do you create these breaks in these moments? Because the Spanish-American War is a moment, and then the 20s and 30s are a different moment, if you will. There are some continuities, but there are a lot of breaks.
Like the chronology.
Chronology.
It's something that I'm still trying to figure out, because like there is clearly a lot of this like between the until like 1912.
Yeah.
It's like on the Argentinian side, it's easy because it's the same government, like it's La Generación del 80, all that period. But then we have the Unión Cívica Radical, and then in the 30s, it's the military coup and all that. So I just frame it until the abolition of the Plaid Amendment, because I think that's really the end of an era.
So if I may, sorry,
Mhm.
I know this is really interesting for me. I don't have these conversations often, so I'm really excited about the work. So for example, with the Plaid Amendment, you also had the Teller Amendment, right?
When they did when they did the Cold War.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So part of what's going on in Cuba and Philippines is that they were fighting. Puerto Rico, there's no fighting.
Yeah.
And they were losing because the US didn't have a military, and they couldn't deal with malaria, and they couldn't deal with corruption in their forces. So I wonder also to what extent that simple fact that the military could not win opened the door for the Plaid Amendment as like sort of alternative to, because when I read the military debates at the time between Elijah Root when he was named the Secretary of War, not because he knew anything about war, but because he was an attorney, president of the American Bar Association in New York, and McKinley wanted to have an attorney. He didn't want a soldier to colonize America. I mean, that's why Root was selected according to his biography.
Okay.
There is an effort to craft a legal narrative or a constitutional narrative that opens the door for a lot of these conversations. In the military, I mean, you start looking at the generals that are occupying Nicaragua, Cuba. These are attorneys that are coming with a legal debate. And again, going back to this effort to transplant the U.S. Constitution, I wonder to what extent is a legal narrative by the military, by elites who are transplanting, sort of shape some of this conversation. And I don't know. These are questions that
Well, also the kind of commercial structural commercial relations and the commercial, right? I mean, because the sort of interesting counterpoint to this is in Michel Gobat's book on Nicaragua, where he shows that the folks of the kind of two competing regional elites within Nicaragua, liberal and conservatives, that the folks who are going to emerge as kind of trumpet, but also as the most ferocious defenders of Hispanidad and Frontistas and so forth, are overwhelmingly the group who are most integrated with the US, who are most committed to emulating the US, who are most commercially connected to the US. Liberals are much more dispersed on various things. So that, in other words, it's not that the kind of Hispanism and later cultural conservatism, and in their case, sort of admiration for Franco and all that stuff, and white supremacy is in tension with emulating the US. But on the contrary, those are the folks who actually who are drawn into it, and then it's partly a reaction to it, but it emerges kind of organically out of that.
That out, please.
Yeah.